Is the liberation of Kherson imminent? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 19th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be figuring out if Russia is starting to press the panic button in Kherson. Let's get into it. Okay, so there's no real changes to the tactical map officially, but what I do want to point out is first, there's been some major news developments. First and foremost, of course, we always are going to ground news. You can use my link in the description to sign up for free. But first, you see that Putin has declared martial law in the annexed regions of Ukraine. That's Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Obviously, these are all contested regions, and it points out none of them are entirely controlled by Russian forces. And while it's not clear what exactly martial law means, it does appear that some draft legislation indicates that it may involve restrictions on travel and public gatherings, tighter censorship, and broader authority for law enforcement agencies. This is, of course, also concurrent with the fact that Russia is beginning to evacuate civilians from Kherson. It reports that even the commander of the Russian forces, right? This is, Russia is notorious for their willingness, their inability to admit defeats, losses, and setbacks. So for them to even acknowledge that the situation is difficult and that residents need to be evacuated is a sign that Russia is definitely facing some pretty desperate times in trying to hold Kherson. What is more interesting is that who is being evacuated. It looks like probably that the civilian occupation administration is being moved out. And this just makes sense. Remember that the occupiers, the collaborators with this Russian effort, they are not going to have a good time when Ukrainian forces get into town. Given the high level of partisan activity we've seen in the South, it's very possible that a lot of these occupation administration officials, unless they were, working for the resistance all along, partisan forces may take care of the problem long before Ukrainian forces even have a chance to properly, arrest, detain, try, and convict collaborators. So it makes sense then that Russia is going to try its absolute best to get its allies out of Kherson and probably try to evacuate. I imagine they may try to evacuate residents, but I actually suspect who they're trying to evacuate are probably Russian passport holders and Russians who are pro-regime, if nothing else, to sort of spin the narrative harder that, Russians are discriminated against in Ukraine, etc., etc. But the fact that Russia is pulling civilians out of the city means to me that they are going to prepare either to cede the city to Ukraine or fight block by block to try to hold it. One of the things that's interesting, and this is, if you see it on Twitter, just assume it's a rumor, but that the general of Russian forces, Sorovikin, is preparing the Russian public for the surrender of Kherson, describing that, spinning a narrative that Kiev may use banned weapons. We can't afford to expose the population to it, and hard decisions must be made. This, obviously, Russia has not historically in this conflict shown much regard for civilian infrastructure, civilian damage. They haven't really, you can literally look at the news yesterday to see the level of consideration civilians have gotten in this conflict. So really, this may be spinning, making a virtue out of necessity when the Russian military may be unable to hold Kherson and is therefore trying to spin its coming surrender as a noble act. Okay, let's talk about the tactical situation of how this could have happened, right? When we look at the map, you say, Paul, they're not really that close. And you can see that there's actually been a pretty significant embargo on information from this section of the front. And as we know, this map, Deep State, right, they go by acknowledged gains and losses, usually either when the evidence is overwhelming on something like social media, for example, a Ukrainian flag being hoisted in a town square, or when you have both sides acknowledging that a change to the battlefield. So it is very accurate, but sometimes very conservative, which means that if, say, the Ukrainian forces and Russian forces are both not acknowledging changes to the Kherson front lines, we may not actually see it in this map. But what did we talk about before? Well, as we discussed months ago when the Kherson offensive started, that Ukraine's efforts were probably going to take part in a multi-pronged offensive, trying to get Russia to commit its limited reserve forces. And that appears to be exactly what has happened, right? We can see here that there was a breakthrough in this northeast corner, right up here near Vysokbilia. And when they burst through, Russia had to stabilize this front lines or risk its troops being encircled or a total collapse of its front. And so you can see here, Russia had to reallocate some of its combat reserve to stabilize this front line. These troops are locked into their positions, locked in heavy combat, which means that if they have another prong of their offensive with combat power available, that would be the time to double down and push harder, because you know that Russia doesn't have any additional troops left in the gas tank. And that's what I suspect is probably going on, right? This fighting here has locked Russian troops, Russian reserves in place, and now another force is going to be pushing hard, redoubling its offensive efforts, possibly reinforced by troops from the north, right, who have, now that the Kharkiv offensive has stabilized into fixed lines, it's possible that they've even been reinforced. So they're going to be pushing harder towards Kherson. And what will we see? Well, it's tough to say how close they are likely to get. There's a lot of open space here, pockmarked by individual villages. There's, of course, an airport that Russia is using as a military airfield. There's a lot of potential military targets here if indeed my thesis is correct and Ukrainian forces are going to be trying to break through from another direction. And that obviously the northeast is very easy, straightforward. There's this M14 highway that you can use as kind of your thoroughfare to run yourself right into downtown Kherson, where, of course, Russia has had a lot of time to dig in and prepare for fighting. Evacuating civilians is probably a later step in that process. I imagine once civilians are out and martial law is declared, then Russia can begin to use civilian buildings as tactical sites, right? You can turn an apartment complex into a giant bunker. But, of course, if there's people living in it, and especially if you consider it an independent region of Russia, administratively no different than St. Petersburg or Moscow, you can't have your military just kicking indoors, legally speaking, and occupying apartments. So you've got to, work through some legal steps first, and I think the declaration of martial law is doing that. Now, again, the real question on everyone's mind, mine included, will Russia simply yield Kherson, or will they turn it into a bloodbath? Will they try to dig it in? I actually suspect the answer is they may try to dig into Kherson very hard. The reason being is that, there's a lot of this occupied territory, right? But they can still, it'll be very hard for Ukrainian forces to cross this river, and Russian forces defending Kherson could actually be resupplied in sort of the same way the Ukrainian forces that defended Severodonetsk were able to hold out for a long time and really burn a lot of Ukrainian combat power simply because they were able to maintain a lifeline through Lysychansk. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. I know, right? You're like, Paul, only a couple of huge news items. But as always, if you want access to uncensored combat video breakdowns, that's the Patreon. Link is in the description. And if you want, check out Ground News for free, also in the description. I'll see you guys in the next one.